Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to begin by apologizing to all of you for being slightly late. At the beginning of this workshop, inshallah, we'll make up for it by talking faster, and hopefully we'll get through all the material that we need to. I'd like to also say salam especially to our scholars who are present, and I'd also like to request you please to come forward. Inshallah, we'll be able to benefit from our other scholars as well during the course of our discussion. And so anything that I say that you would like to add to, comment on, please consider yourself to be also sharing the responsibility of conducting the workshop with me. Please, Sheikhna, please come forward. Inshallah. Then please, from that place, do participate and add your guidance. And also, Sheikh, if you would like to do that as well. Now, just to be able to see all of you better, I'm going to apologize to those of you who are sitting in front. I know that I'm a little taller than normal, and some of your necks may get strained having to look up at me, but I want to be able to see everybody, so I'm going to stand up for at least a portion of the workshop. And I'd like to actually begin with a few questions, and then, inshallah, we will end the workshop with a question-answer session where you will be able to ask any questions that you may have. The question that I would like to begin with is, what does it mean in a practical sense or a theoretical sense for us to say that Islam is a religion of balance? When it comes to our spirituality, when it comes to our worship and our devotion, our ibadah, when it comes to our interactions with non-Muslims, in general, many Muslims have had it beaten into our hearts and our minds and our souls that Islam is a religion of balance. We understand that, and we believe in it intellectually, and in some cases we may even have examples from our religious teachings, we have examples from the lives of the Prophet and the Imams that show us that balance, but we don't always have a good idea of the dynamic nature of that balance. And so it becomes somewhat trite. It becomes somewhat superficial for us to say that Islam is a religion of balance. What I mean by that is that we define for ourselves an extreme. That these groups of non-Muslims, for example, some of them go too far in one direction, some of them go too far in the other direction, and we are in the middle. And it's always possible for any individual or for any group of people to say that wherever we are, this is the happy medium, and extremes are defined by distance from where we are. So therefore, that medium state or that balance is not something that moves us dynamically in a certain direction, but it's simply a way for us to relate to other people, sometimes constructively and sometimes not so constructively. So I want to hear from the members of our audience that what practical examples do you have that, well, for example, when it comes to celebrating holidays, when it comes to wayfaring on a spiritual path, when it comes to worship, when it comes to finances, any area of life that's relevant to you, that Islam is a religion of balance, and here is how that balance is defined. Or on a theoretical level, how are we to understand what it means for us to discover that balance? Those of you who are courageous enough to share your insights, or perhaps questions that you may have in that regard, please raise your hand and join in the conversation. You will regret not raising your hands and having me talk monotonously through the entire course of the workshop. Don't subject yourselves to that fate. Does anybody have any examples? Sure. Alaikum salam. Do we have an extra microphone for the audience members, or?
I can ask the brothers to see if we can get one at the moment.
Sure. Or, well, those of you who are close, I can give you the microphone actually.
So Islamically, I think if something is balanced, it's not just a benefit to the individual, but also to the community. So when we think about balance in Islam, it's not just about going to extremes in terms of like only serving the community, but also serving yourself. Or it's not just about serving only yourself, it's also about doing things that are of benefit to others.
Okay, that was a very good comment to begin with. That one of the dimensions that we can use in Islam to discover what is balance is that it should be comprehensive in its standards. We live in a society that is very individualistic. When people think of enlightenment, when people think of advancement, when people think of right and wrong, the first standard that comes to mind is often the individual. And the effects of an action on society at large are often not taken into consideration or not appreciated, even on a very material level, let alone the effects of our actions on a spiritual level, the effects of our actions on history, on the impression that people will have of Muslims. If I do something, then you are not going to say that Sulayman Hasan, who has that biography, did this. Many of you will say that a scholar who was trained in Qom, who studied with these teachers, who works in this Islamic center, did this. And so that will reflect on Baytul Ilm, where I teach. That will reflect on Qom, where I studied. It might reflect for many people on Shiaism as a whole. It might reflect on Islam for many non-Muslims or even for many Muslims. And each and every one of us also has those groups that we are a part of, and we are responsible for the reputation that we give to ourselves, that we bring for our families, that we bring for our societies and for our religion and for our imams. There are many ahadith in that regard. With respect to parents, for example, there is a hadith that you should not be a person when you behave in society. People will say, did that mother never teach her son or her daughter manners? And that is, in fact, one of the aspects of ihsan to parents that we are taught in the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. And that is one of the forms of goodness or bir to parents that we are to do whether our parents are alive or whether they are deceased. To bring a good name to them. That when people see us, they say that, well, this person was raised right. Even if we weren't raised right. Even if we were raised by wolves. But because people might not always know that we were raised in a jungle, and they might give the credit to our parents, it's an act of kindness to our parents. There is also a hadith of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, that when you act in society, recognize that people are going to say, Ha'ula ashabu Ja'far. These are the companions, or in our case not companions, but the followers of the Imam, the followers of Ahlul Bayt. We attribute ourselves to them. And so if I say something, if I do something, it is going to reflect in people's minds on those to whom I am affiliated. And that is a responsibility that we have. So one aspect of balance that we have in Islam is to understand the repercussions and the effects of our society on ourselves as individuals and on all of the other circles that we are influential in. And those other circles should not be defined purely materially. That is a point that comes from our religious ideology and our beliefs. That we reflect not just on those recognizable groups that we are a part of, but even on the air and the land that we reside on or in. We reflect on those to whom we are connected with our beliefs. So for example, if there is a scholar, a pious person, their company is something that will have a good effect on our soul. Even if we're not directly learning anything from them, even if we are not actually doing anything, being in a masjid, not just by virtue of its psychological effect, but by virtue of the collected sincerity and the dedication that has been made of that land for the sake of worship of Allah and service of Allah. Being in that place has an effect on us that being in another place cannot have. It doesn't really matter if we are spending that time actually doing salat or reading Quran or doing something else entirely. So this type of effect, or this type of comprehensiveness, which follows from what you were talking about, it might actually have been exactly what you were referring to, that is something that we as Muslims believe in, even though we cannot always perceive it. We don't always see how that reflects on us, or how our performing our Fajr prayer in a masjid, so that the masjid flourishes, even if nobody notices it, even if it's not visible, but it's something that makes a masjid flourish. That is something that is an important thing. And I want to just make a comment about the state of Islam in America. Some of the things that I say during the course of this workshop, I want them to be a challenge to habits that we have as individuals and as a Muslim community. I don't ask you to agree with everything that I say, but I do ask that you take it and decide whether it's something that deserves further thought, whether if you feel that needs an immediate rebuttal, I would welcome that, and please tell me that you think I am wrong for these reasons. But think about some of these issues and see if maybe some of the things that are taking place within the Muslim community in America are not issues that we can deal with more effectively in our own planning and in our own lives. The example that I want to give is something that I've noticed most clearly in Islamic communities on the East Coast, but it's something that probably exists in different parts of the Islamic community in America. And this is that people are often cynical with regard to Islamic centers. They might have masajid that are not run effectively, or that have internal politics, or people think they have internal politics, or whatever the issues may be. And so you have groups of Muslims who come together, and they say that we're going to have a weekly program. They might do a traditional program with the speech, a lecture, ceremony of mourning for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. They might do something a little bit less traditional, another kind of activity, maybe a book club, whatever it is. But they will do it outside of a masjid. And when these types of activities begin, they sometimes draw people who until now would go to a masjid. Because in many ways, this program is being done without the baggage that comes. And if you have a masjid, there is baggage that must come. Even if you start it with the best of intentions, a lot of money has to go in just to turn on the electricity. There is often a certain formality of bylaws and a constitution that are required in order to be recognized as a legal entity in the United States. And that brings politics in, even if it may not be intended, or it may not be intended to be a negative thing. When these groups form, they sometimes take people who until now were going to the masajid, because they find that this is something that is a lot more efficient. It's kind of like what Amazon did to our poor deceased Borders and perhaps soon to be deceased Barnes and Nobles. Right? You don't have the same fixed costs, so you're able to offer a product sometimes more effectively and more cheaply, and so more people will say that we'll browse the books at Barnes and Nobles, but we'll buy them from Amazon. That type of a dynamic has set in certain cities in the United States, in certain communities within our own Muslim experience in America. And that is one of the issues of balance that we want to achieve as a Muslim community. And we don't have a great deal of models that we can look to from other religious communities, and in some cases perhaps even from the Sunni community within America, because it's a different goal that we have. But in trying to determine whether this is a problem, and some people might say it's not a problem, it's a good thing. Those Muslims deserve to fall by the wayside, and what's important is to have events and programs that can actually fulfill the needs of those people who are coming. But then there are other effects that come on the side. When we want to determine how big of a problem a particular issue is, like this problem that we just mentioned, and what are potential solutions, the way that we are going to do that is by attuning ourselves more and more to what are the different areas that our actions can affect and do affect, and what is the best way that we can affect all of those different areas. Conceivably, again, hypothetically, it might be possible that I go to a masjid that is somewhat dysfunctional, but with a view that over the next generation, over the next several generations, I want to have institutions that are flourishing, that are bringing benefits not just to those who are interested in that particular activity, that particular camp, that particular activity, but towards broader society. So that's one area that we will be looking at, inshallah. What other examples do we have of what it means to be balanced from an Islamic perspective? It can be something very simple, very trite. What does Islam say about finances? What does Islam say about how to dress? Does anybody ever make a conscious decision when they go to purchase a new wardrobe, that what would my Islamic values say about whether to choose this outfit or that outfit? Or when we are making our financial decisions, do we ever have that question in our minds that while Islam wants us to not be materialistic and it wants us not to be take a vow of poverty, so how do we decide where to spend our money? That's the kind of thing that, whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, all of us are faced with those types of decisions. What to eat, where to eat, how to make decisions with regard to what kind of car to drive, what kind of house to buy, what kind of subjects to study in college, what kinds of clothes to wear or to buy or to gift to other people. So what, for you, has that balance, Matt? It doesn't have to be limited to these examples, but any other examples that you might have. Go ahead.
Well, for me, when I'm shopping for clothes, it has to be long, it has to be baggy, and it has to be appropriate to wear outside, where I'm still keeping modest. Like, it has to be modest.
So modesty is an important aspect of dress, and just as a reminder, that is not just for sisters. Modest dress is a requirement in Islam, Quranically, for those who wish to be part of the believers. The Quran in Surah An-Nur, it says to the Prophet, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ, that tell the believing men that they should lower their gazes, and that lowering of the gaze is an indirect expression for modesty, and for the believing women that they should also lower their gaze. It starts with men. That verse of the Quran, or those two verses of Quran, Surah Nur, verse 30 and 31, they do mention a slight difference for men and women. But the underwriting principle, which is غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ, or lowering the gaze, or modesty, that is shared for both men and women. The difference is that for women there is the added expression وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, that they should also take care that their finery or their adornments are not exposed, except that which is naturally exposed. And the commentaries of Quran explain what that is. So men also should be considering modesty in choosing their clothes. And that's something that, unfortunately, if you go to the average Muslim gathering or masjid, you will find that our sisters, of course, they often bear the brunt, and there is much improvement that is needed as a whole within the Muslim community. But also for our brothers, when people are praying, when they are interacting, that type of modesty is often not found in our culture. That's an aspect of the values that we should have, and we can talk about how to achieve that balance in dressing modestly, but also not being seen as the person who is simply wearing a formless, shapeless, and a non-identifiable amount of clothing, whether for a man or for a woman. So that was a good comment, and Sister, I think I saw somebody else with their hand up, please.
The morals we have, they're more than just thoughts. They have structure, reasoning, and right.
I want to try to hold this to prevent the interference. The morals that we have,
They're more than just thoughts. They have reasoning and structure behind
they
it.
have reasoning and structure behind it, and that's an important point. The more we can understand the reasoning and the structure behind the teachings that we have from the Imams, the better we will be able to approach making decisions with regard to how to present ourselves within society, whether it be in a non-Muslim society in America, or in a Muslim society if we ever are visiting, or if we're living temporarily, or for a long-term in a Muslim society. Is that from me, or is that something else that's going on?
It's probably something else.
Chairman?
You were talking about balance, right?
Yes.
Yeah, an example of balance, I think, would be also an example of things that differentiate us as Muslims from other religions and sects, which is that we give individuals the right to examine our book, the Quran, and tell them this is our text, sacred text that we believe in, but unlike Christians, you are welcome to come and investigate it for your own. All Christians believe in the Bible.
I'm going to just mute this and see if maybe that sound stops. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
If you can't hear me, raise your hand. Okay, I see a thumb up. That means that you can hear me in the back. Can you please repeat that, brother? Sorry.
No, I was saying our example of balance.
We can
is
yes, we invite people to examine our books and
sacred
critique.
text, but at the same time they have the right to investigate it their own, critique it, or whatever they want. Unlike Christians where they give Bible to someone, this is the absolute truth. You don't have to believe in it.
And that's actually exactly the next point that I wanted us to move towards. So thank you for that well-timed transition. The next point that is needed actually is for us to understand, once we have to have insight into what it means to be balanced. Balance should not simply be a means for me to say that, well, I'm mourn in Muharram for 2 months and 8 days. So it's a very extremely unworthy Shi'i who only mourns for the first 10 days of Muharram. They wear their Shi'ism lightly. And then it's extreme when people mourn the entire year and they never have any happy occasions. If you tell them Eid al-Fitr, they will say, well, Eid al-Fitr was also a day of sadness for our Imams at many different times during their lives. That extreme is defined by my preference. And there might be somebody else who says that, well, to mourn for 10 days in Muharram is balance. To mourn for 2 months and 8 days, that does not have any hadith to back it up, that's extreme. And to just mourn on Ashura, that is the lower extreme, and so it's balanced to mourn for, say, 40 days until Arba'in, or to mourn for the first 10 days of Muharram until Ashura, or whatever the case may be. So the first point was that balance is for us to understand the comprehensive nature of the goals that Islam has for us, to connect with those goals, to understand that our values are not meant to be just rituals, but they have a purpose behind them. And the next point is for us to understand that as Muslims, not only do we invite non-Muslims to question and to argue and to debate, but also we as Muslims have a right, and more than a right, an obligation to question and to try to work through certain solutions. And there is a problem with the religiosity that many of us are used to. We might come from cultures that are top-heavy or that are hierarchical, and in some cases that top-heavy or that hierarchical culture has influenced our understanding of Islam as well. This is a point that, again, I want you to hear from me. I'm not asking you to agree with it, but certainly it's something that I think is worthy of thought. There's a story that I tell frequently because I find it very enlightening. Sayyid Sadr was once asked by somebody about his view regarding smoking. Right? Now this is an area where many people have very strong opinions. There was a time when many of our fuqaha had not issued clear fatwa against smoking. There was a time when many of our fuqaha used to smoke themselves, because at that time they weren't really aware of the harmful health effects of it. So for whatever reasons, there were people who would often criticize very strongly, why don't our fuqaha take a stronger stand against smoking, and this evil will be removed from our society. And not many of our fuqaha have issued different wordings, fatwa, that explain the Islamic position on smoking and other things that are detrimental to a person's health or wasteful of resources and so on. But the answer that Shaheed Sadr gave was something that actually returned the agency to the questioner, rather than stripping the questioner of agency. He said that, does a person who knows what we now know as a society, who has access to information about the harmful effects of smoking, does that person really need to go and get a rubber stamp from a religious authority in order to know that smoking is haram or that they should not do so? Now, the questioner may have asked as an individual. Most likely, though, the questioner was not somebody who actually wanted to smoke. Most likely, the questioner was somebody who was saying that, well, in Najaf or in Iraq, we have so many people who smoke, and if Shaheed Sadr takes a stand against it, then a lot of those people will be motivated to quit smoking. And the answer was that what kind of a society is it that cannot make clear decisions, or that requires a crutch to make decisions that should be obvious to the individual? There's several different harms that come from it. In the first place, we will not be a society that is able to be a strength and a source of support for our religious leaders, for our maraja, if we are not able to think for ourselves, if we don't have the agency and we don't know how to exercise that agency effectively. Number two, it will also be a society that will often have a great deal of ups and downs. Right? What that means is that medical research with regard to many different areas is constantly developing. Sometimes there are minor ups and downs, sometimes there are radical reversals. What's important for us is to ask from our scholars, to receive from our scholars guidance about what principles are operative, and then to apply those principles according to our knowledge and according to our experience. And that is the type of answers that we often get from our maraji, but it's not often the way that the question is worded or understood. So that weakness comes not from the scholarly authority, but it comes from us as a society. We will ask, for example, whether smoking is halal or haram. And we will criticize an answer that isn't yes, no, black, white, that says, well, if this and if that. And then this is something that you will hear very frequently, that, well, what kind of an answer is this? They should just give me the answer because I might want to get a clear answer for myself. Or I may have asked the question because I wanted to show it to somebody else and say, told you so. And that if this, then that answer is not really good to lord it over somebody else about how wrong they were. The problem with black and white answers, when they are given and when they are demanded, is that circumstances change. The black and white answer gives you no insight when circumstances change. And the states of knowledge change, and the black and white answer gives you no insight about what to do when circumstances change. Right? So for example, if we find out that smoking is not harmful to people who have a certain genetic makeup, right? They're not as susceptible to the emphysema or the other harms of smoking. Right? Now, if the answer that we were given, is an if-then answer, that if it reaches this level of harm to the body, if it is wasteful in these ways, then it becomes haram. We can still apply that answer to our particular circumstance. But if all we have asked, or all we were given is a yes-no answer, that when I find out that for a person with a certain constitution or a certain body type, a particular food or drug or whatever it is may not have the same effect that it has for the majority of people. Is there anything that I can do with that answer? It becomes a static process. So what the brother said is very important, that in Islam, we have a certain place for questioning, for asking, and generally our effort should be to try to understand the philosophy that we are to apply with our own agency within our lives. And that is what allows our decisions to be dynamic, to move us in a certain direction. Now, I'll give you an example. I know that the electoral season has passed, but that's a perfect example of this type of a situation. Many people, they ask whether Muslims or we as Shia community in America should vote or participate in the electoral system at all. And many of you probably asked that question or have heard that question asked and answered. What are the answers that you have heard? You should vote.
Vote as a block.
Sorry?
Vote as a block. Block vote.
Okay, vote as a block. That's one answer that is sometimes given in the philosophy that is expressed. Has anybody heard a different answer?
You shouldn't vote.
You shouldn't vote? Okay. Any more specifics?
Different parties.
Vote for different parties, meaning like a third party, for
Yeah.
example, Ron Paul or the Green Party, something like that. That's another answer that is sometimes given.
To vote at the, not at the national level, at the
That's an answer that is often given by different scholars within the Shi'i community especially. Vote at a local level, don't vote at a national level because of the relative harm or benefit. So some of you may have heard that answer. Any other outstanding answers that you have heard?
vote blank.
Vote blank, so you're voting a vote of protest. That's an answer that is often given by scholars in Muslim countries where there are different considerations at play. Some of you may have heard that answer given for America as well. Now, what I want to say, though, is that what's important for us as Muslims is to ask not whether we should vote or whether we shouldn't vote, but for us to ask, what are the principles that we should be thinking about? Once we ask what are the principles that we should be thinking about, what does it mean to vote for the lesser evil? Or not to vote, but to support the lesser evil. At what point does support for the lesser evil become an evil in itself? Because there is that danger that I say that, well, Obama seems a little bit less bad than Romney, but at what point does that actually become strengthening the lesser evil and making it a stain that is going to be harder to remove in its own time? Right? These are the things that we need to be thinking about, those operative principles. And then we need to say that, well, we will make the decision, and if we find out that, for example, we abstained from voting, and the greater evil came, then 4 years later, 2 years later, 20 years later, we may discover that maybe we did something a little bit wrong. And we can rectify our wrong answer from before and make it better. Dynamic change, that growth that can come in our own lives, it's only going to be possible if as a community and as individuals, we give ourselves the space. We plan our lives in such a way that there is room for that growth. Room to make a wrong answer, to choose the wrong answer, to make a wrong decision, but within certain limits. Right? There are some wrong decisions that we can make, some wrong turns that we can take that will preclude our ability or make it much more difficult for us to get back on the right path again in the future. But then there are many types of wrong decisions that we need to make. Not because making the wrong decision is what is important, but because exercising the agency is important. And if we could have made the right decision from the beginning, great. But what's important is to make that decision ourselves, not to take it on somebody else's authority, so that if we make the right decision, we continue to grow. If we make the wrong decision, we learn from it and we become a stronger person. That was the perspective that our imams engaged in. There are many different examples in Usul al-Kafi, but I'll just mention, I'll reference one. a debate that Imam Baqir والسلام, our fifth Imam, had with one of his companions, Humran ibn A'yan. Humran at that time was a relatively young companion of Imam Baqir. The debate was about the reality of Iman and Kufr. And are people who do not believe in the Imams, are they even Muslim? Can they go to heaven? Can they not go to heaven? What is that state? And the Imam, number one, did not give a clear answer to Humran. And the Imam allowed Humran to engage with him and to argue back to him. In fact, the hadith says that both parties raised their voices. People standing outside of the house heard their raised voices. So to all appearances, it would have been an argument back and forth. Now, Imam Baqir, yes, he was dealing with a young and maybe a little bit of a hot-headed companion, but Imam Baqir, throughout his life, had enough respect and he had enough prestige to be able to silence somebody who was in his presence. It's not as if the Imam was engaging with somebody who was young and hot-headed and the Imam had no choice but to submit to that person's argumentation. The Imam chose not to exercise that prestige. And in one of these debates, it's actually, this wording is reported from Imam Baqir. He said that, Humran, right now you are young. When you are older, you will appreciate that what I am saying is right. In other words, what the Imam said is that I'm not too concerned about you being wrong. It's not really that important to me. It's natural at this state for you to have principles but not understand how those principles are to translate into practice. The mistake that many of us make in our own decisions is that we don't give ourselves the space to grow. And so we're marching 100 miles an hour at one direction when we're 20, and then when we change, we lose the steam, we lose the momentum, or we start marching with equal velocity in a different direction. If we give ourselves that space to grow, if we understand in what capacity we are to refer to our scholarly output by our living scholars, by our past scholars, then we will have a much easier time of setting the red lines within which we can exercise our own judgment. The important point is to set the red lines effectively. If you have good red lines, then you can kind of let yourself be at peace. Because you know that even if you make a mistake, it will be a mistake that you can rectify. It's not going to be a mistake that's going to turn you away from the path of guidance. Is that point clear? That's a point that I think is often missed in our discussions about what Muslims should do. Somebody will say that Muslims should learn from the Jews. They're very successful. Somebody would say the last thing we should do is learn from the Jews because they're successful but they're evil. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying that these are the responses that you often hear from people. Very one-sided, very black and white, very decisive. And so whether right or wrong, whether very wrong or slightly wrong, they are static positions. They are not a process that is going to lead that individual or a society that is guided by those principles towards greater insight and greater meaning in their actions in the future. It's not so important whether you vote in the local elections and refuse to vote in the national elections, or vote in the national elections as well, or don't vote at all, or vote with a blank vote, whatever you decide to do. As long as you understand what are we trying to accomplish as a Muslim community in America. Is the trajectory that the Catholics have followed in the last 50 years in America, is that somewhat the trajectory that Muslims are likely to follow or should follow? Should we give the same importance to establishing those types of charitable institutions, those types of intellectual institutions? Is the trajectory that the Jews have followed generally favorable, in certain cases favorable? What is the trajectory that we want to follow? And then, once we have those goals, then You might decide to do it one way. I might decide to do it another way. But we will be able to interact constructively. We will be able to learn from one another. We will be able to grow and gain insight as time passes. But if somebody gives you a perfect model for 2013, right, and in 5 days when the year starts, you start to implement that perfect model. Right? You find out, is it recommended to wear white? And what color shoes should you wear? How should you dress? How should you talk? How should you interact in society? But you don't have the dynamic approach to gaining insight. That model might work very well for you for the year 2013. But then you're not going to be any stronger in 2014. So up until this point, those points that we have talked about, any questions, concerns, anything that you think needs to be fleshed out?
Where do we look to for these goals? I mean, how do we, and there's no one large leadership or body of leadership that can set these goals for us. And I think that's a struggle a lot of us have had.
Yeah, where can we look to for that guidance? That is why I think, and this is something that I will be talking about, inshallah, during the next workshop that we will have about the Facebook profile of the 12th Imam. Not being an expert on the 12th Imam, and certainly not being an expert on Facebook, I don't really know what I can contribute except a few thoughts that are tangentially related to that topic. But that's an important point, and I'll just mention one dimension of it to answer the sister's question right now. As followers of Ahlul Bayt, when we don't have access to our Imam, basically we don't have access to our diet. It's kind of like we know what we need to survive, and we don't have access to it. It's as if the Quran were taken from you. Ahlul Bayt are together with the Quran. So just as if you didn't have the Quran, what would be left of Islam? If you just had the memory of the Quran but you couldn't actually approach it, you would be in a very compromised state. The fact that we don't have ready access to Ahlul Bayt means that one part of that scale is something that we don't have ready access to. So the very first thing that it should give us is a great deal of humility, a great deal of concern. Now, it's not that we don't have access to Ahlul Bayt. It's not that that's disappeared. We do have the life story, and we do have the presence of the Imam of our time amongst us. But we don't have ready access. Right? So that's the comparison I was making. It's not as if the Imam or Ahlul Bayt have disappeared from our lives. But because we don't have ready access, what that means is that we have large questions, small questions, important questions, superficial questions. We can't get answers. It's like we're hungry and we know we don't have the food that we are intended to eat by God available. So now we're going to go scavenge. And we're going to try to scavenge for the best possible foods that we can. But there are going to be various types of grasses. We'll pick up our children's books and we'll make that stone soup that we read about. Some of you might remember that story or not. We're going to do things like that. So when we go to our marajah, when we go to our scholars, the perspective that many people have is, all right, that's about it. That's what we need. Right? That fills a psychological space that should not be filled, cannot be fulfilled by anybody but the 12th Imam. And what that does is, psychologically, it takes away the humility that we need to be able to grow. If we maintain that humility and that recognition of the space that the 12th Imam, or that guidance of connection to infallible knowledge, is to have in our lives, then we will still seek guidance from our scholars, because we're not going to get any better scholarship than from our marajah. But we're not going to use the answers that we get to feel self-satisfied. We will also be looking at the totality of Islamic history. It will still be important to us to study Sheikh Mufid, Sheikh Saduq. Not because we're doing taqleed to them, but because given that we can't get perfect answers, even if I have a legal obligation to do taqleed to a particular marja, I know that that is not a ma'soom. And the collective of the maraji also cannot take the place of a ma'soom. The collective of all of humanity and all of creation cannot take the place of a ma'soom. So that humility will give me a constant need of being put in touch with whatever scholarship, whatever insight I can access. At the very least, we will start with our maraji, we will start with the totality of scholarship that has been produced within the Islamic world, within the Shia school of thought, since the time of the Imams. And that is where we will look. But we're going to get provisional answers, and there's no way around that. We're not going to get definitive answers. And so I'll expand on that theme more, inshallah, in the next workshop. But to the point that it's relevant to our topic today, we're going to need to have that humility, and then we're going to need to have a connection, each and every one of us, to trying to connect with the scholarship that has been produced, that is being produced, in order to gain further insight. So any other questions, or can we move on?
So in a situation where you have to decide between the bad and the worst, would you not choose at all? Or what would you do?
Well, if you have to choose between bad and worse, and that is basically the type of decision that we're going to have in our lives in America. Right? There is a hadith, many of you are probably familiar, this relates to our topic specifically today, but also in a more general sense, about our attire and our presentation. That it is better for a Muslim woman, a believing woman, not to see a non-mahram man and not to be seen by a non-mahram man. That is a hadith of Lady Fatima sallallahu alayha. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. Now that is a valid statement. It's also important, though, for every Muslim to be able to protect themselves and those they need to protect within society. And in today's society, if a person starts her life from the time she becomes baligh by not seeing or not being seen by a non-mahram, except in cases of necessity, then in terms of the life experiences, in terms of the confidence, in terms of the education, to be able to be a strong Muslim and pass on that strength to not just children, but society, it may be very difficult. So there is also another equally important Islamic value that doesn't contradict the hadith of Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha, but it is also part of that comprehensive picture that we have. We are to be strong, we are to be confident, and we are to be knowledgeable about our religion. Now, Lady Zainab salamullahi alayha, she acquired that strength and she acquired that knowledge from her own home. But for many Muslims, their parents might not know how to read Quran. So how is that Muslim young woman to acquire the confidence and the knowledge of Islam? Obviously, it might not be possible by never being seen and never seeing a non-mahram. So we have different decisions. Our ideal would be to be able to have a society where it would be possible to acquire that strength, to acquire that cultural resource, and fulfill the ideal expressed by Lady Zahra. But we're living in America, even if you were living in Iran or somewhere else, it might not be possible to do so. So you have to choose between different options which are not ideal. And that is where I think, though we took a long time with it, the perspective that we outlined is so useful. Basically what you will say is, what are the red lines? What is not allowed in Islam? What type of interaction is not permitted? So for example, some mujtahids will say that for a non-mahram man and women, not just for the woman, but for the man or for the woman, to be together in a place where nobody else can enter is not permitted. It's known as khalwa. I think it's the dominant fatwa among Ahl Sunnah. It's not the dominant fatwa among the Shia, but it is one of the opinions. Right? So if I am with a non-mahram woman in a car, and the doors are locked and nobody can come in, even if she's in hijab, even if there is nothing improper about that interaction, it's haram simply by virtue of being alone together in a place where nobody can enter. Right? Now, if I do taqlid to somebody who says that's a red line, that's a red line. I won't cross that red line. Right? So I might go to school, I might get a job, but I'm not going to cross that red line. The more common opinion among the Shia, though, is that khalwa in that sense is not haram in itself, It's haram if there is a fear that it will lead to a sin. So if a person can protect themselves, a man or a woman, then simply to be alone in a place where nobody can enter itself is not haram. Unless there is a fear that it might lead to something Islamically improper, in which case it will become haram. Similarly, when it comes to shaking hands. Now there are different fatwa that are given. Is it forbidden absolutely? Under no circumstances are we allowed to shake hands with a non-mahram? Or is there an exception for cases where it might cause a harm to the image of Islam or offense to the individual? Right? So that will set the red lines. But let's say, for example, that I do taqleed to somebody who says that it's okay to shake hands with a non-mahram if, for example, that person will get a bad image of Islam by my not shaking hands. That legal answer is not enough, because it will also have an effect, first of all, on my soul. There might be a case where I will practice that fatwa religiously and justified, but I will become desensitized to certain things. That might not be good for me. Number two, it might have an effect with regard to the Islamic society. Have you ever been in an experience where, let's say that you're at a graduation ceremony and you're ready to say that I can't shake hands for religious reasons, but by circumstance the person in front of you is an also visibly practicing Muslim. And they go and they shake hands and they also give a hug, and then you're like, well, what can I say now? I'm a different kind of Muslim, I don't do it for religious reasons. And so you kind of lose the ability to even express your religiosity. That's also a consideration. Right? That's what I was saying, that we can't just take a static approach. We can't just take the fatwa and say, well, that's what's important. If it's allowed in Islam, we have to have other considerations that are in our mind. But the approach is that we get the red lines from our fuqaha, from Sharia, from the marja that I did taqleed to. Within those red lines, now I exercise my agency. It's haram for me to do this. But how do I refuse or extricate myself from that situation requires creativity, it requires thought on my part. I can do so offensively, I can do so delicately and elegantly. Or it's halal for me to do this. But is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? How is it going to affect future Muslim interns at the same firm? Or how is it going to affect future students who are applying for the same scholarship, or whatever it might be? That is also a concern that we are to make sure that we have in mind. There's a hadith from our fourth imam that I think is relevant to the question, and this is it's an interesting hadith. It's in a book called Makarim al-Akhlaq by I think Al-Fadl ibn Hasan al-Tabrisi, or al-Tabrisi, it's pronounced differently. He's a Shia scholar of the 6th Hijri century. The hadith is like this. Imam Zain al-Abidin puts on a good pair of clothes. It says, "Fi kharaja fi thiyabin hisan." He went out in a nice outfit. And he walked out the door, and then he rushed back in the door, and he had a maidservant. He said to the maidservant that, "Can you bring me my old clothes?" And he changed into his old clothes, and he said that when I was wearing the good clothes, it's as if I was no longer Ali ibn Hussein. I wasn't myself. I didn't feel like I was myself. And so, it's better for me to wear my old clothes. That's the incident. What do you get from that incident? When it comes to how to dress in America, when it comes to how to present yourself in this society, what's the lesson that you learn? Any thoughts?
Be yourself.
Be yourself. Okay, good.
You should trust your internal instincts, because if you're going to do something or wear something or behave in a certain way that is going to make you feel unfamiliar with yourself, that should be a warning sign to you as to what your values and your beliefs.
Yes, I think both of you are coming to the same point, and that's important. Some people will take from that it's better to dress simply than it is to dress in a fancy way. That is not the right answer or the right approach to take to this hadith. That it's better to dress simply than it is to dress in fancy clothes. Imam Zain al-Abidin was not making a statement against wearing a fancy clothes. If it were something that is not appropriate, Imam Zayn al-Abidin wouldn't have bought those clothes and he wouldn't have walked out with them in the first place. Imam Zayn al-Abidin is not like you and me. You know, where we go and we spend a lot on an outfit and we walk out, we're like, no, this color doesn't suit me, and so we go and return it and then start the process again. If it were a statement about fancy clothes being a problem, Imam Zayn al-Abidin would not have worn them at all. But what was important, as you said, be yourself, or as you said, to look at the effect it has on you, to make sure that when we dress, the thing that we are looking at is how our soul is being influenced by the way we groom ourselves, by the clothing that we wear, by the type of environment that we create for ourselves, and be aware of the effect. Now, it might very well be the case that in certain cases, Imam Zayn al-Abidin went out in fancy clothes even though he would have preferred to wear his old clothes. In that case, there was no other consideration that made him wear the expensive clothes. He came back, he said to his servant, "Can you bring me my old clothes?" And he went back out. In other cases, though, the Imam might not have been able to do that. He would have had to suffer the harmful effects of the fancy clothes, for example. And what would the Imam do in a case like that? He would be aware of the effect on his soul, and he would retune his worship, his charitable giving, other decisions that he makes in order to make sure that he does not harm his own soul because of a certain superficial decision that needs to be made at certain times. That is found in a hadith of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. Generally, Imam Ja'far Sadiq was very well dressed. In fact, many of you may have heard the hadith where, according to some reports, Sufyan al-Thawri, according to other reports, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, came to the Imam and said that, why are you dressed in good clothes? It's not how Islamic scholars should dress. And the Imam replied that that's not the case. Now, once when the Imam was sitting in his home, the Imam was asked about his clothes. He had apparently a patch somewhere on his shirt. So people were staring at it saying that, you are a prominent member of Medina, you shouldn't be wearing clothes with patches. And the Imam said to the person that there's a book there, and the hadith doesn't mention what the book was, but presumably it would be something that was a collection of the wisdom of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, or the earlier Imams, that was in the house of the Imams. And he said to the man, read that book. And that wisdom that was in that writing is that la imana liman la haya'a lahu, that a person who does not have modesty cannot have faith. Faith and modesty must come together. Wala mala liman la taqdira lahu, there is no wealth for a person who is not able to manage wealth. If you can't manage it, then you can be very wealthy, but your wealth will not remain. It doesn't have any value religiously. وَلَا جَدِيدَ لِمَنْ لَا خَلَقَ لَهُ. And there is no new or good for a person who does not have something old. That's a very important point when it comes to how we dress, when it comes to what kind of house we want to acquire. This is the last point that I will make, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. When it comes to what type of car we drive, right? Some of us may remember that, as students, we had that old, beat-up, used car, and then when things get better, we get used to living in a little bit of luxury. You push a button and the seat adjusts itself. You can have a camera and you can parallel park easily. And it sometimes comes to a point that over time people forget that you can still get around in a beat-up old car where you actually have to turn your back to parallel park. It's easy to forget. Many people who have immigrated and have seen real poverty in different countries, but have lived in this country for 20 years, they might not really be able to even survive in that old environment. And in Islam, there's nothing wrong with being able to afford those good clothing, that good house, and all of those things. But what this hadith of Imam Ja'far Sadiq reminds us, and many other hadith, if we had time, we could look at some of them, is that if you don't have some old things, if you don't keep it real, if you don't remember where you were or how else it's possible to live, then you will not be able to properly appreciate the good things that Allah has given you. So that's an important point for Muslims living in the West. It's not about how you dress, but it's about how it affects your soul. Get that $1,000 suit if you need it to give a professional appearance. The same thing with other accessories that you might have or whatever. I just threw a number out of my hat, $1,000. I'm not saying that that's the baseline. But my point is that maintaining that connection to the effect on our soul and then making sure that we are not desensitizing ourselves to things that are important Islamically is what is going to preserve our proper dynamic in our lives. Increase our zuhud and our asceticism even if we are living in the lap of luxury. Increase our sincerity and our devotion even if we are living among a materialist society. We won't become materialistic ourselves. So I will stop there. We did have a few other hadith to look at, but I hope it has been a productive discussion, inshallah, and I'll open it up to questions if any of you would like to ask any questions.